What if I told you that one of the greatest minds in human history, a man praised as a literary genius, a global celebrity in his time and a symbol of success, was quietly unraveling inside? What if I told you that even after writing War and Peace and Anna Karenina, Leo Tolstoy would lie awake at night wondering if life had any meaning at all? Imagine this for a moment. You've achieved everything the world says should make you happy. You've created art that outlives you. You have wealth, respect, admiration, influence. But when the applause fades and the room is silent, something inside you whispers, "So what?" And no matter how loud the world praises you, that whisper won't go away. This wasn't some temporary sadness. It was a spiritual crisis, so deep, so suffocating, that Tolstoy began hiding the ropes in his house, not out of some aesthetic impulse, but because he didn't trust himself not to use them. This is a man who once wrote that death was so terrifying to him he could hardly sleep at night, not because he feared pain, but because life itself felt like an unsolvable riddle and he was running out of time to answer it. You might think, that's madness. How can someone so brilliant, so accomplished, fall into such despair? But maybe you felt it too, that strange, quiet ache, that sense that no matter how much you do or how much you gain, something vital still feels missing. It's not sadness, it's not depression, it's deeper. It's the existential pull towards something more, even when you can't define what more is. Tolstoy's story isn't just a historical curiosity, it's a mirror, because the same forces that pulled him toward the edge still whisper to you in quiet moments. When the noise dies down, when the lights go out, when you stop pretending that your next achievement, your next relationship, or your next success will finally be enough, and you're left asking, why am I here? Tolstoy tried to answer that question the way most thinkers do, by turning to philosophy, science, reason. He buried himself in the works of great minds, trying to dissect the nature of existence like a surgeon with a scalpel. But every theory he studied, every intellectual system he built, collapsed under the weight of one unbearable question. If everything ends in death, what's the point? He once wrote that life felt like a cruel joke, like a traveler who falls into a well, clinging to a branch to keep from falling to his death, and then sees a mouse gnawing at the branch, slowly, inevitably. That's how life looked to him, a momentary delay before the fall, and no amount of brilliance could talk him out of it. Have you ever tried to explain away the void with logic, to make sense of the soul with a spreadsheet? That's where Tolstoy was, drowning in knowledge but starving for meaning. And that's when something extraordinary happened. He began to notice the people around him, not the noblemen, not the artists or scholars, but the peasants, the farmers, the simple folk who lived on his land. They had no education, no philosophy, no grand theories about life, and yet they had peace, a quiet, steady sense of purpose. They didn't talk about the meaning of life, they lived it, without needing to explain it. At first, Tolstoy couldn't understand. How could people who had so little live with such serenity? But the more he watched, the more he realized they had something he didn't. They had faith. Not in the sense of blind obedience to dogma, not the rigid, fearful religiosity he had rejected in his youth, but something purer, something quieter, an inner knowing, a felt connection to something greater than themselves. To them, life wasn't a riddle, it was a gift, and they didn't need to answer it, they just needed to live it well. That realization shattered Tolstoy's illusions, because suddenly it wasn't intellect that mattered most, it was sincerity. It wasn't knowledge that saved him, it was humility. He began to understand that some truths aren't meant to be thought, they're meant to be lived. They're found in simplicity, in kindness, in the silent prayer of a heart that chooses to love, even when it doesn't understand. And so, this man, who had once been the toast of the aristocracy, began to change. He gave up his wealth, refused the royalties from his books, dressed like a peasant, walked among the poor, sought no titles, no status, no acclaim, because he no longer needed the world's applause to validate his existence. He had found something far more precious, the courage to live in alignment with his soul. And what about you? You've probably been told that success means climbing higher, achieving more, becoming someone important. But what if the real path isn't upward but inward? What if the highest truth is found not in brilliance but in stillness? Not in mastering life's meaning, but in surrendering to it. Tolstoy didn't find the meaning of life in a book or a theory or a religion. He found it by watching people live as if their lives had meaning, and he realized that perhaps that was the answer. Not to ask what life means, but to live as though it does. To stop demanding proof and start offering presence. Maybe that's what you're being called to do. Not to figure everything out, not to achieve more, but to let go of what doesn't nourish your soul. To simplify, to listen, to live honestly, and to trust that somewhere in the middle of all this mystery, your life is not meaningless, it is sacred. Because the question isn't what is the meaning of life, the question is what meaning will you choose to give it? You've been taught to chase certainty, to believe that if you can just find the right philosophy, the right system, the right belief, then everything will finally make sense. But what if the very need for certainty is what's keeping you from peace? That's the shift Tolstoy made. He let go of the obsession with answers and began living in alignment with what his heart already knew, that love matters, that kindness matters, that truth isn't always loud, it's often quiet, like a whisper in the soul. And when he stopped needing to understand life, he began to experience it more deeply. Imagine if you could do the same. Imagine if you stopped treating life like a problem to be solved and started treating it like a sacred story that you're writing every day, through your actions, your choices, your compassion. What if meaning isn't something you find, but something you become? That's what Tolstoy discovered as he stripped away everything the world told him he was supposed to be. He saw that most of his suffering didn't come from life itself. It came from trying to live a life that wasn't truly his, from pretending, from performing, from chasing an identity that never felt whole. And if you're honest with yourself, maybe you've felt that too, that quiet disconnection, that sense that you've been wearing a costume for so long you've forgotten what your real face looks like, that longing to return to something simpler, truer, more aligned with who you really are, before the world told you who you should be. Tolstoy began to live as if every moment mattered, as if the small things, speaking gently, giving generously, walking barefoot in the grass, were the real meaning of life, not because they were grand or philosophical, but because they were real. They came from the heart, not the intellect. And that's what changed him, not a doctrine, not a revelation, but a return to presence, a willingness to live honestly, even when he didn't have all the answers, especially when he didn't have all the answers. There's a story he once shared about a man lost in a forest. The man walks in every direction, trying to find his way out, but no path leads anywhere. Eventually, he stops trying to escape and simply learns to live in the forest. He plants food, he builds shelter, he helps others who are lost, and in doing so he realizes he doesn't need to escape to have meaning. He needs to engage fully, lovingly, consciously. That's the essence of Tolstoy's awakening, not to conquer life but to participate in it, to stop standing outside it like a critic and start living it like a creator. You don't need a map to begin, you need courage, the courage to ask what really matters to me, and then live as though the answer is sacred. Tolstoy began writing essays that were banned across Russia, not because they were violent, but because they were truthful. He questioned the state, the church, the systems of power that convinced people to live by fear rather than by faith. He believed that the most dangerous lie you could ever believe is that someone else has the right to define your purpose for you. And maybe that's something you've forgotten too, that you don't need permission to live meaningfully. You don't need credentials to be kind. You don't need clarity to be courageous. You just need to listen and respond. With presence, with intention, with love. There's a moment in every seeker's life when the old world begins to crack, when the stories you've told yourself begin to dissolve, when the things that once motivated you, status, approval, success, lose their shine, and in that space, something terrifying happens. You realize you no longer know who you are. That's not a crisis, that's an invitation. Because who you are is not what you've achieved, it's not what you've accumulated, it's not even what you believe. It's how you show up, moment by moment, choice by choice. Tolstoy realized that the peasants on his land had a secret he had overlooked. They didn't live for recognition, they lived for connection with the land, with their families, with something sacred they didn't need to name. And that's what saved him. Not intellectual brilliance, but spiritual simplicity. Not arguments, but authenticity. You've probably been taught to believe that spiritual truth must be complicated, that only the enlightened or the educated can access it. But the greatest truths have always been the simplest. Love your neighbor, forgive, be honest, stay humble. These aren't revolutionary ideas. They're revolutionary because we forget them. Tolstoy remembered. He remembered what it meant to live, like the meaning of life wasn't something out there, but something already inside him, waiting to be honored. And once he made that shift, his entire life changed. He began walking barefoot, eating plainly, giving away his possessions, not as a performance, but as a declaration, this is enough. I am enough. Life is enough. Rarely Tolstoy sighed. And you, can you say the same? Can you look at your life, not your resume, not your plans, not your image, but your life, and say, this is enough? Because maybe that's where the meaning lives, not in what you'll someday do, but in how you meet this moment, with open hands, with open heart, with reverence for the ordinary. Tolstoy didn't find the meaning of life in a library. He found it in a garden, in the face of a child, in the weathered hands of a man tilling soil with purpose. And if you really listen, you'll find it too, not in the loud places, but in the quiet ones, in the silence between breaths, in the spaces where your soul still believes in beauty. That's the truth no one tells you. You're not here to figure everything out. You're here to feel it, to live with your whole heart, to embrace uncertainty as a doorway, not a threat, to surrender the illusion of control and fall in love with the mystery of being alive. Because you are alive, right now, and that is enough. You don't need to abandon your life to discover what matters. You just need to begin noticing again. The way the sun moves across your floor in the morning, the quiet smile of someone who loves you, the rhythm of your breath when everything else falls silent. Meaning isn't found in distant philosophies. It's right here, hiding in plain sight. Tolstoy came to understand that the hunger for more knowledge, more possessions, more certainty, wasn't a flaw in human nature. It was a misunderstanding. You keep reaching outside yourself, believing that the next answer, the next goal, the next version of you will finally make it all click, but it never does, because the hunger isn't for more, it's for deeper, it's for real, and you can't fill that kind of hunger with illusions. There's a part of you that already knows this, a part that's tired of pretending, tired of chasing shadows, tired of trying to become what you think will finally make you worthy. That part of you, the part that aches for peace, that longs for truth, is the part Tolstoy spent his life rediscovering. And when he finally let go of trying to explain life, life began to explain itself through him. That's the paradox. When you stop trying to master life and start allowing life to move through you, something shifts. You begin to notice the harmony underneath the chaos. You start to see that everything is connected, that every act of kindness ripples through the world in ways you may never see. You realize that your existence isn't random. It's a thread in the vast tapestry of something divine. Tolstoy once said that truth, when it's truly felt, doesn't need defending. It has a quiet power of its own. And that's true of you, too. You don't have to fight to be seen. You don't have to prove your value to anyone. Your being is already enough, not because of what you do, but because of what you are, a living, breathing expression of consciousness, awakening to itself. And yet, it's easy to forget. You live in a world that worships speed, performance, and control. A world that tells you to stay busy, to stay productive, to stay distracted. But deep down, you know none of that leads to peace. What leads to peace is presence, and presence requires courage. The courage to slow down, to feel what's really happening inside you, to ask the questions most people spend their lives avoiding. Questions like, what would my life look like if I stopped performing and started listening? What would I let go of if I truly trusted that I'm already enough? What would happen if I stopped seeking and started remembering? Tolstoy's courage didn't come from perfection. It came from surrender, from the decision to stop running, from the willingness to turn around and face his emptiness not as an enemy, but as a doorway. And that's where everything began to change, the moment he stopped trying to escape his despair and started asking what it was trying to teach him. Maybe you've felt that same invitation. Maybe your suffering isn't punishment. Maybe it's a teacher, a call to return, a wake-up call from the depths of your own soul, asking you to come home, not to some perfect version of yourself, but to the version that's honest, present, real. Tolstoy stopped asking the question, what is the meaning of life, and started asking a better one, how can I live a life that feels meaningful? And that's the question that changes everything, because it shifts the focus from the abstract to the actual, from thinking to being. You don't need to have the answers before you begin. You just need to begin. Begin choosing presence over performance. Begin choosing truth over comfort. Begin choosing faith, not in dogma, but in the quiet guidance of your own heart. That's what Tolstoy meant when he said that faith is the force of life, not a belief system, not a theology, but a way of being, a willingness to live as if your existence matters, even when you can't explain why, as if love is worth giving, even when it's not returned, as if beauty is worth creating, even when no one sees it. That's faith, not certainty, but commitment. And the moment you begin living that way, something awakens in you, a stillness beneath the noise, a knowing beneath the doubt, a kind of spiritual gravity that starts pulling you closer to who you really are. Not the version of you that's trying to prove something, the version of you that's quietly waiting beneath the surface, whispering, you are already whole. Tolstoy walked away from everything that didn't align with that truth, not out of guilt, not out of rebellion, but out of clarity. Because once you see through the illusion, you can't go back. Once you realize that the ladder you've been climbing is leaning against the wrong wall, the only sane thing to do is climb down and start again. And maybe that's where you are right now. Climbing down, letting go, reconsidering what you thought mattered. That's not weakness, that's awakening. That's the moment you begin living your life, not someone else's. Tolstoy's journey wasn't about escaping the world. It was about re-entering it, more conscious, more compassionate, more alive. He didn't reject life, he embraced it more deeply than ever before. But he embraced it on his own terms, with his own heart, in alignment with something timeless and true. You have that same choice every day, to choose depth over distraction, to choose meaning over mimicry, to choose to live not according to what the world tells you is important, but according to what your soul knows is essential. The meaning of life isn't hiding from you, it's woven into every breath you take, every person you love, every act of honesty, however small. And the more you align with that, the more alive you become, not in the way the world defines success, but in the way your spirit defines truth. There's nothing to chase, there's only something to remember. That you are part of something sacred, that your existence is not an accident, and that even in your most uncertain moments, you are being guided by something deeper than reason, something stronger than fear, something more real than the illusions you've been taught to believe. And maybe that's what Tolstoy was trying to show us all along. You were never meant to live by someone else's definition of purpose. You were meant to discover your own, not by reading it in a book, not by hearing it from a stage, but by listening to the quiet guidance that has been with you all along, the same guidance that stirred inside Tolstoy when the applause of the world no longer satisfied the hunger of his soul. That's the paradox of awakening. It rarely comes at the beginning. It often comes after you've achieved what you thought would bring happiness, after you've crossed the finish line, only to realize there's no prize waiting for you, only a question that has lived inside humanity since the beginning of time. Why are you here? And the answer, if it comes at all, doesn't shout. It whispers, it nudges, it reveals itself in the most ordinary of moments, in the way you sit with someone who's hurting, in the way you speak with tenderness when you could choose pride, in the way you offer your presence when you have nothing else to give. That's where Tolstoy found his meaning, not in grand philosophies or final conclusions, but in the lived simplicity of a quiet, honest life, a life that stops reaching for the heavens and starts touching what is real. You don't need to give everything away to find peace, but you do need to give up what isn't real, the false identities, the masks, the endless striving to become someone more instead of being the someone you already are. You can feel it in your chest, can't you? That quiet ache when you know you're out of alignment, when you're pretending, when you're performing, when you're betraying yourself in the name of being accepted. That ache is sacred. It's not a flaw. It's a signal, a call from your soul to return to what's true. And Tolstoy answered that call, even when it led him into conflict with the very society that once celebrated him. He knew that the truth often costs you your comfort, but it gives you something far more valuable in return. It gives you peace. Not the kind of peace that comes from silence or stillness, but the kind that comes from no longer fighting yourself, no longer splitting yourself into what you feel and what you show, no longer needing the world to validate what your heart already knows. When you begin to live that way, something shifts. You stop measuring your life by how much you accomplish and start measuring it by how much you align. You begin to feel a new kind of success, one that can't be captured in awards or numbers or praise, a success that feels like wholeness, like you finally belong in your own skin. Tolstoy called it the moral law within, a compass that doesn't point north but inward, a truth that doesn't depend on institutions or ideologies, a voice that lives quietly inside you waiting to be heard beneath the noise. And it doesn't ask for perfection, it asks for honesty, not to get it right all the time, but to be willing to return, to keep listening, to keep choosing what's real even when it's not easy. Because truth isn't always convenient. It often asks you to let go of what you thought you needed, to leave behind identities you've built, to walk away from comfort in order to live with integrity. And that path, it isn't always praised, but it is always worth it. Tolstoy's family didn't understand him. The elite circles he once belonged to distanced themselves. The institutions he questioned tried to silence him. But he didn't stop, because once you've seen what's real, you can't pretend you haven't. Once you've tasted truth, the counterfeit never satisfies again. And maybe you're feeling that now. That pull away from the surface, that deep internal knowing that life was never meant to be lived like a transaction, that you weren't born just to accumulate, impress, or perform. You were born to love, to awaken, to remember. There's a part of you that has never been lost, a part untouched by the stories you've believed, a part that's still radiant, still whole, still connected to something timeless. That part is what Tolstoy spent his life returning to. And that's the same part in you that's listening now. You've searched through books, through relationships, through achievements. You've tried to find meaning in the world's reflection. But maybe the only place you haven't looked deeply enough is within. Not to isolate yourself, not to escape, but to rediscover the source. The source of your peace, the source of your intuition, the source of your meaning. It's not complicated, it's not far away. It doesn't require a perfect past or a clear future. It requires presence, willingness, humility. And once you begin to live from that place, your life changes in subtle but profound ways. You begin to value moments over milestones, connection over competition, presence over performance. You start to notice beauty where you once saw nothing. You begin to feel gratitude for the things that can't be measured, the quiet sunrise, the unexpected laughter, the softness of your own breath in the dark. And slowly life stops being something you need to figure out. It starts being something you're grateful to participate in. That's the path Tolstoy walked. Not a straight line, not a perfect journey, but a return, a deepening, a becoming. And that same path is open to you. Not as a demand, but as an invitation. The invitation to stop chasing and start remembering. To stop striving and start trusting. To stop asking what life means and start living as though it matters. Because it does, and so do you. There's something powerful that happens when you stop trying to escape life and begin embracing it exactly as it is. Not just the highs, not just the revelations, but the quiet in-between spaces that most people overlook. The ordinary moments, the silent mornings, the way your chest rises and falls without your permission. When you realize that even these small things carry the fingerprints of something sacred, you stop needing the extraordinary to feel awake. Tolstoy didn't retreat from life because he hated it. He retreated from illusion so he could finally fall in love with what was real. And what he found wasn't some cosmic answer carved in stone, it was presence. He learned to live without demanding explanations from the universe. He began to see that not everything needed to be understood to be loved, that the mystery itself was part of the beauty. And that's the shift waiting for you too, not to become someone else, but to become yourself more completely, to live with fewer masks and more meaning, to stop dimming your light for the sake of fitting in, to stop apologizing for the fire inside you that's always longed for something deeper. At some point you have to decide, not in your mind but in your life. Do you want to keep chasing the version of happiness the world sold you, or are you ready to walk a different path, the one that may not make sense to others but makes you feel alive? That's what Tolstoy did, not all at once, but piece by piece, layer by layer. He unlearned the stories that never belonged to him. He stopped playing the role, he stepped off the stage, and he came home to himself. Imagine what it would be like if you did the same. If you stopped measuring your worth by how busy you are, how many people approve of you, or how much you've accomplished. What if you started measuring your life by how aligned it feels, by how much truth you can carry in your voice, by how present you can be with another human being, even in silence? Tolstoy discovered that meaning isn't something you accumulate, it's something you embody. You don't need to reach a certain level of enlightenment to start living truthfully. You just have to be willing to stop pretending, to tell the truth about what matters to you, to stop betraying your heart for the sake of appearances. He wrote, "The only absolute knowledge attainable by man is that life is meaningless." But that wasn't the end of the sentence. That was the beginning of his transformation. Because when all the borrowed meanings collapsed, something more powerful emerged. A lived meaning. One not based on belief or theory, but on the way you move through the world with love, with compassion, with humility. And maybe that's what this moment is for. A gentle interruption, a breath between stories. A reminder that your value isn't in your achievements, it's in your awareness. It's in the way you treat people when no one is watching. It's in the quiet choices you make when your ego has nothing to gain. If the world forgets your name tomorrow, will you still know who you are? That's what Tolstoy faced in his later years. He let go of fame, of titles, of recognition, not because he thought they were evil, but because he realized they weren't real. They were masks, layers, distractions, and when he took them off, he felt something underneath them that he hadn't felt in years. Himself. You are not here to be remembered, you are here to remember. What it means to be fully alive, what it feels like to follow the truth even when it's inconvenient, what it means to choose love, not as a feeling, but as a daily act of courage. Meaning isn't something you declare once, it's something you renew every day. When you wake up and choose not to numb yourself, when you have the hard conversation, when you show up fully even when it would be easier to disappear, That's the kind of meaning that transforms lives, not through ideas, but through presence. And no, it won't always be easy. Tolstoy wrestled with himself every step of the way. He was human, he stumbled, he doubted, but he kept returning. That's the invitation, to return, not once, but again and again, to the place within you that remembers what the mind forgets, that your life is already holy, that your breath is already a miracle, that your soul has always known the way. You don't need to abandon logic, you just need to stop worshipping it as the only path. There's a wisdom deeper than thought, a knowing that comes from living close to what matters, the kind of knowing that grows in silence, in stillness, in surrender. Tolstoy learned to listen to that stillness, and through it he realized that love wasn't an emotion. It was an orientation of the soul, a way of seeing the world, a way of choosing again and again to live in harmony with what is real. And you can do the same, no matter where you are in your life right now. Whether you're at the beginning of your journey or deep in a season of confusion, it's never too late to ask the question that opens everything. What would my life look like if I lived it with truth as my compass? Not truth as ideology, truth as felt experience, as emotional integrity, as spiritual honesty. You don't have to become a monk to walk that path. You just have to be willing to ask the questions most people avoid, and to let those questions transform the way you live, the way you love, and the way you show up in this world. Because meaning isn't hiding in some distant future. It's here, right now, in this moment, in your willingness to breathe deeper, to feel more honestly, to choose with your whole being to be awake. That's what Tolstoy left behind. Not just stories, not just essays, but a legacy of awakening. A reminder that the meaning of life isn't a puzzle to be solved, it's a fire to be kindled. And once that fire is lit inside you, it begins to illuminate everything. Not just the big moments, but the smallest ones too. You start to notice it in the way you pour your morning tea, in the way you look someone in the eyes when they speak, in the way you hold space for silence without needing to fill it. These are not meaningless habits. These are rituals. These are offerings. Each one a quiet declaration that your life is not accidental, that your presence carries weight, that your being here matters more than you've ever been told. Tolstoy didn't find that in cathedrals or castles. He found it in the soil, in the slow, sacred rhythm of a simple life, in the honesty of manual labor, in the prayers that came not from sermons but from stillness, from watching the wind move through the trees and realizing that the same intelligence that moves the leaves is moving through him and through you, right now. You don't need a grand revelation to begin. You don't need to fix yourself or prove yourself or earn the right to be here. You just need to say yes. Yes to this moment. Yes to who you are underneath the noise. Yes to the part of you that has always whispered, even through the fear and the pretending, that there is something more. And not just more out there, more within you. That's the sacred rebellion, to no longer wait for life to hand you meaning, but to become the meaning yourself. To stop waiting for permission, to stop asking the world to validate the depth of your own soul, because it won't. The world rewards image, but your soul rewards truth. And sometimes choosing truth means losing comfort. It means stepping away from what's familiar. It means being willing to disappoint others before you betray yourself. That's the edge Tolstoy walked. He lost friends. He lost respect. He lost privilege. But he found his soul. He found a life he could look in the mirror and respect. And in the end, isn't that what you want too? Not the life that looks perfect on the outside, but the one that feels honest on the inside. Not a highlight reel of achievements, but a quiet knowing that you lived in alignment with something real, that you listened when it mattered, that you spoke the truth even when your voice shook, that you loved even when it wasn't safe. This kind of life doesn't make headlines, but it creates a legacy that can't be measured, a legacy of courage, of stillness, of awakening. Tolstoy's story isn't about escaping the world. It's about engaging with it more deeply, from a place of integrity, from a place of grounded compassion, from a place that doesn't need to win, doesn't need to dominate, doesn't need to be right, just a place that's committed to being true. And maybe that's what this is all about, coming back to what is true, not in theory but in the way you move through the world, in the way you listen when someone's hurting, in the way you forgive without needing an apology, in the way you stay soft in a world that wants you harden. There's a different kind of power in that. The power of presence, the power of alignment, the power of living a quiet life that burns with purpose, not because of what you gain, but because of what you give. Not because of what you control, but because of what you surrender. Tolstoy's final years were a meditation on that surrender. He stripped his life down to what mattered most. He wrote about non-violence, about love as a divine force, about resisting evil not with hatred but with truth. And these writings, these simple reflections, went on to change the world. Gandhi read them. Martin Luther King was moved by them. These ideas rippled across continents, not because they were loud, but because they were real. That's the power of a soul in alignment with its truth. It doesn't need to shout, it simply radiates, and it changes everything it touches. So ask yourself, what kind of legacy are you leaving? Not someday, not when your life is perfect, but right now. What is the energy you bring into a room? What is the wake you leave behind in someone's heart? What would happen if you began living like that is what matters most. You don't need to be famous. You don't need to be brilliant. You just need to be honest with yourself, with the people you love, with the life that's asking to be lived through you. Because the truth is, you're not waiting for the meaning of life to be revealed. Life is waiting for you to reveal your meaning through the way you live, the way you serve, the way you love. That's the lesson Tolstoy didn't just write about, he lived it, and in doing so he gave us a living example of what it means to come home to yourself, not a version of yourself that the world approves of, but the version that's been quietly waiting underneath all the noise, the version that remembers why you're really here. And maybe that's why you're still listening right now, because a part of you knows this isn't just a story about a philosopher. It's a story about you, about your choices, your questions, your awakening. So what will you do with that knowing? Will you bury it, distract yourself from it, push it aside and hope it doesn't whisper so loudly next time? Or will you lean in? Will you follow it? Will you begin living your life not as a performance, but as a prayer? You don't need to be ready, you just need to begin. Let this be that moment. Let this be the moment you remember that you don't need the world's permission to live truthfully. You never did. That voice inside you, the one that's always known when something feels off, when something feels shallow, when something feels like it doesn't belong to your soul, that voice has always been right. And the more you listen to it, the more life begins to align around you in ways you never imagined possible. You begin to walk differently, not faster, not with more urgency, but with more awareness, with more presence. You begin to speak with intention, not to impress, but to connect. You start to choose experiences not for their appearance, but for how they nourish your spirit. You begin to sense what Tolstoy discovered so late in life, that the meaning of life is not hidden in some future moment waiting to be earned. It's already here, asking to be lived now. It shows up in how you tend to the smallest things. The way you care for your space, the way you eat, the way you breathe, the way you treat people when no one's looking. These are the invisible threads that weave meaning through your days. Not because they're grand, but because they're yours, because they're sacred, because they're true. You don't have to change the world to live meaningfully. You just have to let the world change you, not by breaking you, but by softening you, by revealing what you've tried so hard to protect, your heart, your humanity, your longing for connection, your need for beauty, and your capacity to live a life that no longer needs to be justified. Tolstoy tried to justify his life with achievements. For decades he poured his genius into books, into ideas, into becoming someone the world would remember. And the world did remember, but the one person who remained unconvinced was him. All the awards or the praise or the recognition, They couldn't touch the part of him that still felt empty, still felt lost, still felt like he was living someone else's version of what it meant to be alive. That part of him needed something deeper. And maybe you know that feeling too, that quiet yearning that says, there's got to be more than this, not more to accomplish, but more to feel, more to give, more to become. It takes courage to answer that call, courage to step off the path you were told would make you happy, courage to risk being misunderstood, courage to walk away from the applause. But on the other side of that risk is something no one can give you and no one can take away. Peace. Not the kind that comes and goes with circumstances, but the kind that settles into your bones, the kind that says, this is enough. The kind that lets you rest, not because everything is perfect, but because you are no longer at war with yourself. That's what Tolstoy found in his final years. Not answers, but peace. Not clarity, but surrender. He became less interested in being right and more interested in being real. He spoke less and listened more. He stopped asking what life owed him and started asking what life was asking from him. And in that question, something opened. A tenderness, a humility, a sense of meaning that couldn't be explained, only lived. You have that same access, right now. You don't need more time. You don't need to be more prepared. You don't need to wait until everything in your life makes sense. You just need to begin treating each moment like it belongs to your soul, like it matters. Because it does. The great illusion is that meaning is out there, waiting to be discovered. The truth is, it's in here, waiting to be chosen. And you choose it every time you show up fully, every time you live with integrity, every time you honor what your heart knows, even if your mind can't explain it. You don't need to know the destination, you just need to walk the path with presence, with love, with the willingness to be changed. Because the real purpose of life is not to arrive untouched, unchanged, unshaken, it's to be transformed, to become more open, more aware, more alive. Tolstoy once said, "The sole meaning of life is to serve humanity by contributing to the progress of the soul. But that contribution doesn't have to be grand. It can be subtle. It can be quiet. It can be in the way you love your children, the way you care for your elders, the way you forgive someone who never said sorry, the way you refuse to abandon yourself even when it would be easier to go numb. These are the sacred acts that carry weight. These are the moments when life becomes more than a series of tasks and turns into a living prayer. And when you begin to live this way, something within you relaxes. The striving softens. The fear loses its grip. And for the first time, maybe in a long time, you feel like you're finally coming home. Not to a place, not to a belief, but to the truth of your own being. You are not here to impress the world, you are here to illuminate it, not by being perfect, but by being present. Not by being invulnerable, but by being honest. Not by being more, but by being whole. And in the end, that's what Tolstoy offered us. Not a formula, not a doctrine, but a reminder that life is not something to win, it's something to receive, with open hands, with a soft heart, with the humility to admit that you may never know exactly what it all means, and the courage to live as if it matters anyway. Because it does. And so do you. You don't need to find all the answers to begin living differently. You just need to be willing to live more truthfully, to notice the quiet ways your soul keeps reaching for something you can't name, and to stop brushing that feeling aside like it's an inconvenience. That longing you feel isn't a flaw, it's a compass. It's the part of you that remembers what matters, even when your mind forgets. That's what happened to Tolstoy. After a lifetime of thinking and debating and building intellectual empires, he finally let himself feel, really feel. Not just the suffering of others, but his own. Not just the loneliness that fame couldn't erase, but the tender ache that said he wanted to live a life that meant something, not just in theory, but in the way he touched people, in the way he treated them, in the way he lived when no one was watching. It wasn't about becoming someone new, it was about removing the layers that kept him from seeing who he had been all along. And that's the journey for you too. Not to become more, but to return to what's already here. That stillness in you that never left, that wisdom you were born with, that part of you that doesn't need a reason to be good or kind or loving. It just is. You were never broken, you've just been busy trying to fit into a world that rewards performance more than presence, a world that teaches you to chase your worth instead of embody it. But you don't have to keep playing that game. You can stop, you can pause, you can remember. And when you do, when you slow down long enough to hear your own breath, to watch your own thoughts pass by without grabbing onto them, something shifts. You realize that so much of what you thought you needed to carry was never really yours. The pressure, the proving, the pretending, it can all be set down. There is something sacred about choosing to live lightly in a world that tells you to carry everything. There is something revolutionary about resting, about not rushing, about tending to your inner world, like a garden that grows best in silence and sun. Tolstoy learnt to live like that. Slowly, deliberately. He no longer needed to fill every moment with action. He began to trust that being was enough, that the simple act of sitting under a tree, watching the clouds move, was not a waste of time, but a return to truth. What if your life isn't waiting to begin when you fix yourself or earn more or figure it all out? What if it's already happening right now, and all that's left is for you to be here for it, fully, deeply, gratefully? You don't need to understand everything to live meaningfully. You just need to be present enough to recognize when something feels real, when something feels right, when something touches that deep part of you that says, yes, this is it, this is what I've been searching for, even if I didn't have the word. And once you start living that way, you begin to see meaning everywhere, in a stranger's smile, in the stillness of the morning, in the way the wind moves through the trees, in the way your chest rises and falls without any effort on your part. Life stops being something you demand answers from and becomes something you participate in with reverence. That reverence is the gateway not to a perfect life, but to a life that feels alive. A life that no longer needs to be justified, because it's no longer being lived for anyone else. And maybe, if you look closely enough, you'll realize that the search for meaning was never about finding something out there. It was always about finding your way back in here, to the place in you that still knows how to be quiet, how to be kind, how to be honest. Tolstoy stripped away the noise until all that remained was what mattered: faith, simplicity, service. He no longer needed to impress anyone. He no longer needed to win the argument. He just needed to live in alignment with what his heart knew to be good and true. And isn't that what you want too? To feel like your life is yours again. To know that the way you spend your days reflects what you value, that the way you treat people reflects what you believe, that the way you show up in the world reflects who you really are. You don't need a perfect past to begin again. You don't need the approval of others to take that next honest step. You just need to trust that there's more waiting for you than what you've been settling for. That there's a life of depth and wonder and peace that begins the moment you stop trying to force meaning and start living it. It won't always be easy. Sometimes it will feel like you're walking in the dark. Sometimes you'll question whether it's worth it, whether slowing down and living more truthfully really makes a difference. But it does. It always does. Because every time you choose presence over performance, you heal something. Every time you choose compassion over control, you restore something. Every time you choose truth over comfort, you awaken something. And the ripple of that choice moves far beyond what you'll ever see. Tolstoy didn't set out to change the world, he set out to save his soul. And in doing so, he left behind a map, not of steps to follow, but of qualities to embody: honesty, simplicity, faith, humility, love. These are not outdated ideals, they're timeless truths, and they're waiting to be rediscovered in you. You don't have to renounce everything like Tolstoy did, but maybe there's something in your life that's ready to be released, some version of yourself that's ready to be retired, some belief that no longer serves you, some fear that's been whispering lies for too long. Let this be the moment you set it down. Let this be the moment you begin again. Hey, you don't need a dramatic transformation. You just need a sincere one. A shift so subtle it might not look like anything has changed, but inside, everything has. The way you wake up, the way you breathe, the way you relate to your own thoughts, the way you stop trying to escape your life and begin to meet it, moment by moment, like an old friend you're finally ready to understand. Maybe that's what healing really is. Not erasing the past, but reclaiming your place in the present. Letting go of the expectation that life should feel different than it does, and choosing instead to touch it exactly as it is, with grace, with honesty, with full presence. That's what Tolstoy did. He faced the ache in his chest and the questions in his soul without running. He walked into the silence. He let it hollow him out. He let the unknowing unravel what he thought he had figured out. And somewhere in that emptiness he found something far more reliable than certainty. He found peace. Not the kind of peace that comes from getting answers, but the kind that comes from no longer needing them. A peace rooted in trust. Trust in something deeper than the mind, something eternal, something that can't be named, only felt. And you've felt it before. In moments you didn't even realize were sacred. When you were sitting alone, and everything felt still. When someone held your hand and said nothing, but you knew exactly what they meant. When a sudden wave of calm washed over you for no reason at all. That was it. That was the meaning, not explained, but experienced. You don't have to chase those moments. You just have to become available to them. You have to create space. Space for slowness, space for stillness, space for the kind of presence that allows life to reveal itself, instead of always trying to control it. You were never meant to carry so much. That tension in your body, the heaviness in your chest, the exhaustion that doesn't seem to go away, that's not a sign of weakness, it's a signal. It's your soul calling you back to the place where the burden can finally be put down. Tolstoy carried so much for so long. Expectations, identity, ideology. He was a man torn between his status and his spirit, his legacy and his longing for something purer. And when he finally listened to the deeper call, when he began releasing the layers that no longer served him, his soul began to breathe again. And yours will too. You don't need to live in exile from your own truth. You don't need to keep performing a version of yourself that was never real to begin with. You can choose a different way, a quieter way, a slower, more honest, more human way. Maybe you already have. Maybe the reason you're here, listening to these words, is because a part of you already said yes. A quiet yes, a trembling yes, but still a yes. A yes to letting go of what's false. A yes to making space for what's true. A yes to meaning, not as a concept, but as a lived relationship with each breath, each choice, each sacred, ordinary moment. It doesn't matter where you've been. It doesn't matter how many times you've wandered or how long you've been asleep. What matters is that you're here now, awake, willing, present. That's enough. That's always been enough. The world will try to pull you back into forgetting. It will tell you that productivity matters more than presence, that success is more important than soul, that comfort is safer than truth. But you know better now. You've touched something deeper, and once you do, you can't go back to the way things were. You can't unknow what you've remembered. And maybe you don't need the whole path laid out. Maybe all you need is to take the next honest step, to choose the action that feels most aligned, to speak the words that have been sitting in your chest, waiting to be freed, to let go of what was never yours to carry. That's the beginning of wisdom. Not knowing everything, but knowing enough to live differently, knowing enough to walk more slowly, to listen more carefully, to love more generously. Tolstoy found his wisdom not in the moments when he was celebrated, but in the moments when he was stripped bare, when there was nothing left to prove, when the applause had faded, when all he had was the ache in his chest and the truth in his soul. That's where he met himself. That's where he met life. That's where he began again. And you can begin again too. No matter how far you've wandered, no matter how complicated things have become, no matter how long you've been living a version of life that doesn't reflect who you really are, it's not too late. It never is. You are not behind. You are not broken. You are not lost. You are waking up. And what you're waking up to is not some new doctrine or fixed belief. It's a way of seeing, a way of feeling, a way of living that honors the depth of your own being. You are not here to survive your life. You are here to inhabit it, to let it break you open, to let it heal you in ways you didn't know you needed, to let it shape you into someone who is less afraid, more alive, and unshakably rooted in what is real. And what is real is this moment, this breath, this quiet space between words where your soul finally feels seen. This isn't the end of your search, it's the beginning of your return. So take your time, let it all sink in, let the questions remain unanswered, let your heart speak without needing to explain itself. And if you feel something stirring inside you now, something soft, something strong, something you can't quite name, trust it. That's the part of you that's always known the way. You don't need to name it, you don't need to hold it tightly, you just need to let it breathe. Let it guide you gently, like a river that knows where it's going. You don't have to know where it leads, you only have to trust that it's taking you somewhere true. That's what Tolstoy discovered in the end, that life isn't a riddle to be solved, but a relationship to be nurtured, that meaning isn't a possession to cling to, it's a presence to live with. And once he stopped trying to dominate life and began to surrender to it, he didn't become smaller, he became free. Freedom doesn't always look like escape. Sometimes freedom looks like stillness, like no longer needing to run from yourself, no longer needing to outrun your questions, no longer needing to earn your place in the world, just being here, fully, lovingly, present. Because when you're present, you remember what the world has tried to make you forget, that you are not here by accident, that your existence is not a problem to solve, that your soul is not something to suppress. It is something to listen to honor, to trust. Even now, as you sit here with everything you've lived through, everything you've questioned, everything you've feared, you're still here. And that means something. That means your story isn't finished. That means the meaning you seek might not be waiting ahead of you, but awakening within you. You're not here to be perfect, you are here to be real, to be soft where the world says harden, to feel where the world says numb, to speak where the world says stay silent. You are here to love, to fall down and get back up, to walk through the dark and still choose to believe there's light, not because you're naive, but because you've seen the alternative, and you're done living in a world without depth. Tolstoy gave everything up, not because he wanted to suffer, but because he wanted to feel alive again. He traded comfort for clarity, applause for integrity, fame for peace. He walked away from everything that told him who he was supposed to be, and toward the life that reflected who he truly was. And maybe you've reached that point too, where the old life no longer fits, where the old stories no longer soothe, where something in you is rising, demanding to be met. Not next year, not someday, now. This is your now, not a performance, not a rehearsal, not a draft. This is the real thing. This is your life. And whether you whisper it or shout it, whether you take small steps or giant leaps, you get to shape it. With your awareness, with your intention, with your willingness to live as if your life already matters. Because it does. No one else can tell you what your meaning is, but when you touch it, you'll know. It feels like alignment. It feels like relief. It feels like coming home to yourself after years of being away. And it may not make you rich. It may not get you applause, but it will make you real. And that is something no one can take from you. This is not a story about a man who had all the answers. This is a story about a man who stopped pretending he did. A man who let go of his image in order to find his essence. A man who turned away from the noise of the world to hear the whisper of his own soul. And you are not so different. You have the same access, the same capacity, the same invitation. So as this story closes, ask yourself, not with urgency, but with reverence, what is the next true step? Not the perfect step, not the impressive one, just the true one. Maybe it's speaking your truth. Maybe it's forgiving yourself. Maybe it's finally being quiet enough to hear what your heart has been trying to say. Whatever it is, trust it. The world may never fully understand the path you choose, but your soul will, and in the end, that's the only approval that truly matters. So breathe, return, begin again, not because you've failed, but because you're finally ready to live like your life is sacred. Because it is. And so are you.